to make sure that we get to those during our conversation with Tatyana. Great. Hi, Tatyana. I think we're just about ready to start. So welcome again, everybody. So welcome back to Cyber 101, which is our street's event series focused on the basics of cybersecurity and cyber policy here in Washington. For those of you who joined us last month, I interviewed Paul Rosenzweig, who is a fellow at the R Street Institute, where we talked sort of like the very basics of cyber, who are the players geopolitically. Today, we're going to talk to the wonderful Tatyana Bolton. She is the policy director for the cybersecurity and emerging threats team here at R Street. And before joining R Street, she joined us from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where she was a senior policy director, and also the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where she was the cyber policy lead in their Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans. She's here today, so we're going to talk about defensive cybersecurity. And just a reminder, this is our Cyber 101 series, so there is no question too basic or too embarrassing. Put them all in the chat and we'll get to them later. We'll start off with a brief presentation by Tatyana. She's going to kind of give an overview of who is in charge of defensive cyber in the United States government, and then we're going to have a bit of a fireside chat. So welcome, Tatyana. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I just want to welcome everybody. I want to start off by saying that I really believe that defensive cybersecurity is the key to a strong national security. And I also wanted to say, I want to remind you, Catherine, that I'm going to keep everything, on the Cyber 101 level. I'm going to not use acronyms as much as I can. Sometimes we can get into a little bit of acronym soup, which people hate. So please virtually smack me if I go off track there. And if I'm going too fast or I lose it, if I'm losing anybody, tell me to slow down and ask questions to clarify. Okay, so let's get started with our presentation here. And then, as Catherine said, we'll go to questions, which I'm eager to hear from you all, what you're interested about. Okay, so defensive cybersecurity. Let's go to the next slide. Basically, last month, we talked about general cybersecurity practices, who's playing. This is a discussion of defense versus offense. So a lot of what we hear about in the news and a lot of different discussions ongoing sometimes focus on offensive cybersecurity. What should cybercom do? What basically the offensive cyber capability within the United States government based in the DoD? What should they do? How are we, what are we doing to protect our networks by going out? Are we hacking other people? Are we, are we doing, are we hacking back? Are we, doing offensive measures? But most importantly, and the problems that we hear about when we see hacks, for example, like the pipeline hack that just happened on one of the largest pipeline operators on the East Coast, is a problem of defensive cybersecurity. So the main differences between defensive and offensive. Defensive cybersecurity aims to protect assets and mitigate risks to those assets, and then detecting them before we have damage. Think about blocking and tackling. You're trying to prevent someone from getting to your goal, right? You're trying to defend on the perimeter of your network. You're trying to make sure that no one can even see inside your network. If you have Wi-Fi in your house, you're trying to make sure that you have strong measures to protect against anybody coming into that network and then, sprawling out and seeing what's happening within the network. Offensive cybersecurity is detecting and disrupting adversary activity. So we're not talking about what happens when the United States, for example, goes and tries to disrupt Chinese activity, Russian activity, Iranian activity. We're talking about building a less glassy house, right? So if you're throwing rocks, you want to make sure that your walls aren't made of glass so you don't get blowback. All right, next slide. Why does it matter? As you can see from the very basics at the very bottom level at data, you kind of go up through these rings of information and cybersecurity sort of areas, and you want to protect them all. You want to protect your data. You want to protect your networks. You want to protect your perimeter. Part of that is physical, right, in the real world. And then all of that, strong passwords, permissions in your systems. Like, for example, you don't want to set permissions that gives everyone in your company. So your company is 50 people. You don't want to give permissions to all of the people in your company access to administrative rights to put new apps on the computers, or your phones, right? You don't want to give access to everybody. You want to limit that. It's the first line of protection for all of these things, from your data, to the networks, to the controls, right? That, for example, can shut down a pipeline or shut down the energy grid. All of these things are vulnerable. And to make ourselves more secure, I would argue that the first thing that you want to do, if you had like 10 pennies, right, and you had 2 cups, one in offensive cybersecurity, one in defensive cybersecurity, I would argue that, and other experts, I think, have agreed, you want to put the majority, if not almost all, of your pennies in the defensive basket. You want to make sure that your people are smart on cybersecurity practices. You want to make sure that you yourself are smart. You want to make sure you're putting in the right policies, that you're smart, like I talked about the permissions. Because once you put all that in place, it makes it that much harder. It makes it costlier for the adversary to come in and disrupt something, right? You don't want to sit here vulnerable, sit around waiting for an attacker to come in because it's too late. It's kind of like we lock our front doors because you don't want someone to come in your house after they're in, right? Like, sure, you can try and kick them out, right? You can try to address that threat, but it's a lot easier to install a fence and install a front door and lock that front door and make sure you have the only key. These are the types of things that we want to make sure we're doing in cybersecurity. That's why defensive cybersecurity is so important. Next slide. So who's responsible? One, not just the federal government, but also private sector. They're all responsible for defensive cybersecurity, as well as private citizens. We have a very robust system within the federal government, state and local governments, and the private sector that coordinates all of these actors to try and support the protection of our critical infrastructure, like hospitals and electric grid, and the financial services sector, like your bank. The sectors that are called critical infrastructure sectors, they're protected by sector-specific agencies. So, for example, the energy sector is protected by the sector-specific agency is the Energy Department. And we have 16 sectors and we have 16 SSAs, or well, I'm sorry, that's not true. We have SSAs that handle all 16. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, covers a significant number of those. Somewhere between 7 and 8 are covered by DHS. The FBI also plays a role, especially in incident response. When something bad happens, often a company or a critical infrastructure sector will call the FBI, who will coordinate with some of these other agencies to respond to attacks. But they also work together to sort of try to prevent all of those attacks. I also would like to point out that it's not just the sector-specific agencies that are responsible for protecting our critical infrastructure. Because, by the way, 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So it's not government systems that we're protecting here. It's private and public systems. It also includes federal government systems, and all federal government agencies, as well as state and local agencies, do their part to protect the cybersecurity of their systems. But most importantly, I would say, especially, the Department of Homeland Security is one of the biggest pieces of this puzzle in our cyber defense. And they do that through, next slide, CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's so secure, it's got secure in its name twice. It has 4 subcomponents, one of which is directly responsible for cybersecurity, and the rest that are supporting elements or elements that are intertwined with its cybersecurity mission. Cybersecurity, infrastructure security, emergency communications, and national risk management. I would argue all of it sort of starts at the national risk management stage, where we take a look at the risks to our critical infrastructure, our private sector, our federal networks, and we determine which critical functions are most at risk, most important, and those that are both most at risk and most important are prioritized highest. They get the most federal government support, the most support from the SSAs, and then we work through all of the steps to protect all of those networks on down the line through the risk narrative. Next slide. As I mentioned, there are 16 of these critical infrastructure sectors and corresponding SSAs. So here you see the connection. You've got chemical, which CISA handles, and commercial facilities, as well as communications, critical infrastructure, dams, emergency services, information technology, nuclear reactors, materials and waste, as well as government facilities, all of those handled by CISA. The rest of them have specific SSAs. For example, the Defense Industrial Base is handled, not surprisingly, by the Department of Defense. Treasury handles financial services, and on down the line. I would argue, and I think that there are a lot of experts that agree that water, for example, protected by the EPA, is one of the least secure and most vulnerable sectors that we have that needs a lot more support. Financial services and energy, for example, are much more secure. They have a lot more resources. They have a lot more expertise in cybersecurity within those agencies, within the centers themselves, or the sectors themselves. And so they are more secure. So you see sort of a have and have nots in this list. You can, I think, kind of make the interpretation of who you think is most secure or least secure. But I think we can all agree that they are not all created equal. Some of them, you may argue, are more important than others. But I think that all of them, all of these things could send us back to the Stone Age, as Bryson Bort said during Hack the Capitol last week, if we were to knock down any one of these sectors. So that's sort of how it plays out. Next slide. All right. So CISA, for its cybersecurity responsibilities, has a lot on its plate. It is the one cybersecurity agency within the federal government that handles a significant number of cybersecurity services, although, as I mentioned before, not the only one. They do training and exercises. They work with FBI on cybercrime like ransomware and the identity theft. They do detection and prevention. They work on resilience of our grid and our other sectors. They work on stakeholder engagement and education. They put out emergency directives. For example, when the federal government decided to pull out Huawei equipment out of its systems, CISA issued an emergency directive. They're called BODs, to pull that Huawei equipment out of its networks. The first step of those directives is often identifying what's on the networks, getting a report back to CISA to make sure that everybody knows what's there, what is vulnerable, if it exists, and then the direction to remove those things from the networks. This also, for example, happened during the SolarWinds hack and the Microsoft Exchange hack, which happened in the last few months. Well, I guess SolarWinds, to be fair, has been going on for a year. But all of these things are the responsibilities of CISA, and they work through all of these things. They have a lot of different offices that handle a lot of different issues. Next slide. So you may think, gosh, given all of this all these responsibilities, SIZZA must be loaded. Alas, it is not. One of the biggest things I think that is a problem is that right now, SIZZA's budget is around $2 billion. And to be fair, $2 billion is a huge amount of money. But given that the SIZZA is the agency that's responsible for federal network protection. So all of our federal networks are supposed to be protected by SIZZA. They're also supposed to be the one engaging and coordinating all of those SSAs we talked about, that list of 16 you just saw. They're also responsible for training and exercising and incident response when companies ask for help when there's an incident. For example, SolarWinds, right? Again, huge hack, very extensive, lots of different issues that needed to be addressed, a lot of remediation that needed to happen. SIZZA has a budget of about $2 million a year, give or take, to deal with all of those things. Now, the American Rescue Plan last year allocated another $650 million to SIZZA, which is great, and I think a good step towards addressing some of these gaps. I will also say that SIZZA, if you don't know, is really only 3 years old. It was established formally in a 2018 law that was passed. Before that, SIZZA was called the National Protection and Programs Directorate. When I came on board at SIZZA, that's actually what it was called. And so it is technically a new agency. However, it's been around for a long time. For example, the NCIC, the Response Center, that has been around first as US CERT, which some of you may have heard of, and then to NCIC, and then now sort of SIZZA Central or the Response Center, for about a decade. So, it's been there. It's been trying to get its legs under it with the advent of SIZZA, with the 2018 Act. I think that hopefully we'll get a little bit more identification of defense, cyber defense, as one of the biggest issues, and therefore possibly increase this budget. Next slide. As a comparison, just for funsies, this is the DoD budget. Now, granted, and Catherine loves to point this out to me, the DoD budget includes cybersecurity funding, right? So because the Defense Department does offensive cybersecurity, and because the DoD is also responsible for the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, as its sector-specific agency, they get funding for that. But even if you took out $10 billion out of that, I think you'd still see that this is a massive sort of difference. Defense broadly obviously addresses issues of our national security, but I think we need to start reprioritizing our risk calculus and the way in which we think about how we protect the nation. Right now, I would argue that we are more vulnerable to cyber attacks and the consequences that come from those cyber attacks than we are from, for example, a land war in China. So I think we need to think about the way in which we fund and we think about offensive capabilities and physical defense versus how we think about cyber defense and cyber capabilities and defensive cybersecurity. Because I think that when we really take a look at our risk calculus, I think we'll see that we are funding it disproportionately to where we actually see the biggest threats. Next slide. The other big thing that I mentioned before, and I'll point to this again, is that we do a lot of this with the private sector. CISA, the FBI, the sector-specific agencies, state and locals, all of them work with the private sector to get this done. Because again, 85% of our critical infrastructure, like the energy grid, like distribution facilities, like our banks, they're all, a lot of them, 85% are privately owned. So that requires collaboration. We achieve that with information sharing and analysis centers, ISACs, and we're still working on how to improve that, how to improve sharing of intelligence, sharing of other information, threats, vulnerabilities, risks, and making sure that we're working all of this together so that we have a coordinated, thought through strategy for identifying risk, for identifying vulnerabilities, and then identifying threats sharing those quickly, making sure that we are doing it as fast as possible so that we are the least vulnerable that we can be. Next. All right. Well, I'm going to stop there. I think I've said a lot. I'm going to pass it over to Catherine with some questions, and then I would love to hear some questions from you all.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a really great overview. I've got some questions for you, and then I know our audience has some questions. I can already see one or two coming in. Just for a reminder, use that Q&A function if you have something you want me to ask Tatyana. Otherwise, we're going to get started. And I guess I want to start kind of broad for my first question. I think I asked this to Paul as well, but I just love getting everyone's opinion. If you had, say, a cyber magic wand, you can wave it and you can change one thing about the way the federal government approaches cybersecurity. What would you change?
Well, I think I sort of made clear with my slides, the one biggest thing that I would change is the funding and the reallocation of resources towards defensive cybersecurity. Because I think that we have, and next month we'll talk about offensive cybersecurity. So, don't get me wrong, it's important and we need it. But I think that we should fund it much more significantly. We need to, and that comes, by the way, or should come with people and hiring more people and getting more people staffed and trained up for cybersecurity so that we are, so that we have the people necessary to execute on all of that huge list of things that you saw SIZZA doing.
So I know there's been some debate generally among cyber policy experts regarding whether or not cybersecurity should be sort of centralized in the federal government, whether or not every agency should be responsible for cybersecurity in its own sector. We saw, in your presentation, the way those 16 different critical infrastructure industries were sort of broken up, and SIZZA had most of them, but some of them SIZZA didn't have. So when you think about the way the federal government should approach SIZZA, do you support a more centralized view, or do you think it's important to keep that sort of disbursement?
So it's a good question, and it's been a question of debate for some time. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission touched on this. I think that there is a role for all agencies to play in defending their own networks, first and foremost. But I also think that the way in which certain agencies have have sort of taken on significant budgets and significant roles and responsibilities in handling cybersecurity is probably misguided. I think that we need to reassess how we strengthen SIZZA and make sure that it has the resources and the necessary capabilities and authorities to do its job appropriately, and then have the appropriate roles and responsibilities sort of resting within the other agencies like energy and treasury and an EPA. But I think that generally speaking, we are a little too dispersed at this point. It does create log jams of information. It creates issues where we can't share amongst even the federal agencies. And when you have that happening, so obviously part of what we have is a federated system, and that sort of is is just a fundamental building block of America. And we like to have our data, our systems, not within one place. We like to see some disbursement. We have 3 branches of government. We don't want one agency to hold all the power, right? And I get that. But I think that we've come to a point where in cybersecurity, we need to treat it like national security, where Department of Defense, for example, is given broad authorities for defense of the nation. And I think national security is part and parcel of cybersecurity. So we need to think about it the same way. And we need to make sure that SIZZA has the appropriate resources that it needs to ensure that it can work with sector specific agencies, but that it is the primary agency responsible for cyber issues.
So I know that one way that President Biden has shown that he is interested in sort of cyber and promoting that is the promotion. There's a nomination of Chris Inglis as a national cyber director. So can you talk a little about what that role would look like if Chris Inglis was confirmed, how the NCD should conceptualize defensive cybersecurity in that role?
Yeah, so this is one of the issues, one of the areas I worked on at the Solarium Commission, working on the National Cyber Director recommendation and the Office of the National Cyber Director. I think it's a fantastic choice for a nomination. Chris Inglis, there could be no sort of better person to lead cybersecurity efforts. He is, eminently knowledgeable, intelligent, thoughtful, and just an overall just fantastic human. So I'm really glad to see that happen. So let me say that at the beginning. I will also say that the Office of the National Cyber Director and the NCD itself, I think we have yet to see how this will play out. But conceptually, the idea is that we didn't have, as Senator Angus King likes to say, one throat to choke in cybersecurity, right? This is part of the issues with sort of dispersing responsibilities in cyber, is that you don't have one person accountable for issues when they arise, like SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange hack, before that, all the other hacks that happened, not Petya. You need to have leadership. You need to have strong leadership in cybersecurity. Now, the National Cyber Director is focused on defensive cyber issues. So you're going to have at least part of this issue of disbursement ideally handled with the National Cyber Director sort of setting strategic level policy from the White House, being the representative that's giving advice to the president on cybersecurity matters. And then offensive cybersecurity would rest within the NSC. In other areas of the White House, dealing with the Department of Defense, dealing with the intelligence communities that are handling the offensive cyber piece. So I think it's yet to be seen what will happen, but I think that we'll get stronger leadership. We're going to get more centralized planning, which I think is good in cybersecurity. We need to make sure that we've thought through that, like I mentioned, that risk calculus that then ties to the resources that we're spending and addressing risk threats and vulnerabilities as they come up as fast as possible.
So I've got a couple questions related to critical infrastructure and cyber. So obviously it's been all over the news, the Colonial Pipeline hack, but it seems to indicate that there are gaps in our defensive cyber capabilities. What sort of steps could we have taken to prevent such an attack, especially given that, it was on a private company?
Right. So this is the biggest issue that the federal government faces. We don't own the networks, but we have to help to protect the networks. And from the reporting that I've seen, it was a ransomware attack on a pipeline, right? Like the ICS systems of a pipeline, but only the IT systems. Okay, so there's two different systems in industrial control systems. There's the IT network that runs what you would expect here, like what you have at your office. It runs your computers, it runs the phones that are connected to it. It doesn't control the actual controls of like the pipeline. It doesn't control the on and off valve that that sends oil or gas down a pipe from New Orleans up to New York. Right, that pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline, that's exactly where it was. It was coming from New Orleans, going up to New York, sending fuel. What happened is that they hacked into the system, the IT system, and locked those controls. But it often, those systems, the IT systems, the computers, are air gapped, because I don't believe everything can be perfectly air gapped, to the actual control systems for the actual gauges and valves and the controls for the pipelines. When it's not a pipeline, when it's not a fuel pipeline, you can imagine this is also the same for like energy pipelines, electricity, in dams, the controls for dams, right? Like these can have significant effects if you have the ability to go into a network, right? Like you somehow either get user credentials and get in, or you hack in another way, or through like malware or something like that. You hack in and you get on those networks, and you can, for example, turn up the levels of lead or the levels of potassium in drinking water. Right. This attempt, there was a hack that attempted to do this in the Oldsmar water system not too long ago. So you're seeing a lot of these things happen. To prevent it is very difficult. We're working as much as we can to protect those systems, right? A lot of systems, for example, are being taken offline, those that were connected, or preventing the sort of digitization of some of the most critical networks so they can remain separate from other networks, right? We also protect them through double access or sort of duplicate access, where you need two-factor authentication, things that we recommend for the average computer user. Same for networks where, for example, in the Department of Defense, right, you need not only your password, but you also need your CAC card, the computer access card, right? You can't get in without both. One is physical, which you'd have to steal physically, right? You can't just do a remote access that way, and you need the password, which could be stolen digitally, right? That gives you an extra layer of protection. So we're trying to improve all of those things. It's often some of the like.
Give just a second. We seem to have just a little bit of technical difficulty. My apologies about that. It looks like we had some technical difficulties on Tatyana's end, probably not hackers. She's going to try to rejoin us in just a moment, and then we'll get to the rest of your questions.
Hello. Well, technical difficulties.
Yes, you are sideways now for me.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
So glad
right.
you could join us.
Wi-Fi issues happen across the board to everyone.
Yes. So we have a bunch of questions. So
Anyway,
yes. So moving on, sort of.
let's get going.
Yes, given the relative weakness of cybersecurity in our water system under the EPA, what can we do to sort of secure water infrastructure? Do we need to bring those systems under the purview of the DoD or SIZZA? We may have more technical difficulties.
Can you hear me? Sorry about that. So I do think that there's something to changing the sector specific agency, for example, to CISA. But again, CISA would need more resources for that. Quite honestly, a lot of this stuff comes down to resources. And so I think that we just need to prioritize and fund under-resourced areas like water security. And there's actually a bill right now on the Hill to try and do that.
So I have a question from someone who's more interested in the state and local aspect of CISA. So what sort of engagement does CISA do with state and local governments and with the private sector in bettering security?
Okay, so the state and local question is interesting. I would say that that is one of the weakest parts of our cybersecurity is how we deal with state and local. In fact, we just released a report on state and local cybersecurity, which I'm sure Sophia or Catherine can put in the chat. We talk a lot about the issues there and what we need to do. The way that CISA does it is that they have 9 regions. And so they send people out in the field and they have people sort of embedded into different regions of the country. They're spread out, the regions just sort of break up the country into different sections. And then there's a regional office in each one of those 9 sections. But if you're thinking sort of FBI field office with like 100 to 200 people, it's more like 9 to 10 to 20. So, the field offices aren't huge. And I think one of the things that we need more of is for us to have, for SIZZA to have more, for more people on the ground to build relationships with those private sector companies that are in those areas, so that we can address hacks when they happen. So one thing I will say is, like, as I've talked a lot with the federal FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who handle natural disasters, right? Not cyber disasters, but natural disasters, although they do help with cyber issues. They are experts in sort of responding, right? And one of the things that they have learned is that the planning and the relationship building and the training, the tabletop exercises are super important to making sure that when an incident actually happens, you have that like muscle memory of talking to people and making sure that you know who to go to, who to call. That's sometimes one of the biggest issues for private companies, right? They have an incident and they don't have one person within the federal government that they can call. Repeatedly, I've heard this from private companies, that they want one belly button, right? And that's part of the reason that we suggested the National Cyber Director.
Oh, I think that's so important. If you don't know how to handle a crisis when the crisis hits, you won't be prepared. So to get back to an earlier point you made, we have a question regarding the diffusement of responsibilities for cybersecurity. And we have a question that's asking, would the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK or the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity in Canada, are those sort of appropriate models we should be using or looking to? I don't know how familiar you are with the UK or the Canadian.
Yeah. So actually, I worked with and talked to and visited the UK Cybersecurity Center. They have a fantastic capability there. I also visited Israel and Israel's Cybersecurity Center, as well as Estonia's, who surprisingly, for being such a small country, has a fantastic cybersecurity posture and planning, and their agency and their defense department does a really good job. To be fair, they get hacked or they have attempted hacks from Russia a lot. Russia likes to meddle in their elections and their systems. They had a major hack in I believe it was 2010, which really made them reconsider what significant resources to put into cybersecurity. I'd hate for the US to have to go through something like that, so Estonia's systems were literally like knocked offline. Everything was knocked offline for, I think for a week. So we wouldn't want that to happen. But I say all this to say that like every country is different. And I know you know that, but for example, Estonia, very small, right? It's the size of like Rhode Island. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but Israel, for example, is really the size of like Rhode Island. And they have, for example, one airport. They have one dam. They have one electrical generating station. So as you think about how that translates to the United States, I mean, same thing with the UK. They're much, much smaller. They also have a different sort of form of government. And so while we try to take as much from those organizations as we could, and there were definitely lessons to be had, and the National Cyber Director was one of those lessons. Putting one person in charge of cyber, at least defensive cyber, was something that they did, and to good result. And so we sort of recommended that the Solarium recommended that we do that. And so, I think there's things that we can take from every country, but unfortunately, because the US is so large, so sophisticated, it has so many different nodes of so many different critical infrastructure sectors. We have a much bigger problem, a much bigger sort of, much bigger plane on which to address cyber risk.
Yeah. So we have a comment here that says, thanks for the great presentation. And they're interested in your final slide on cooperation with the private sector in cyber defense. And they'd like to know, what's the relationship between federal agencies? You've talked about this, but federal agencies and private companies like, but is it vertical with government handing out directives from on top? Is it more horizontal with lots of cooperation? You kind of implied earlier that in some cases it sounds like there isn't much of a relationship at all. And how do we strengthen those?
So this has been one of the biggest challenges for the federal government and the private sector as we handle cybersecurity because of how intertwined all of this is. I wouldn't say it's vertical. I think the attempt is to have a relationship that is integrated and cooperative. The government does not sort of hand down directives to private sector actors to handle their cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The binding operational directives I mentioned that SIZZA puts out, those are specifically for federal agencies. That gives a cue, obviously, to private actors, banks, the energy sector, which for the record could have had that information as well beforehand. So, it gives a cue as to what the government is doing, but it doesn't direct private entities to do anything. One of the things that we recommended in the Solarium Commission for addressing some of these problems was the recommendation for systemically important critical infrastructure. So the idea behind that is that we have a lot, like I said, a lot of private actors, right? If you picture the United States, if you picture like a singular municipal water facility, may only give water out, to 5,000 homes, right? Important, but it's not the one that handles like New York City, for example, right? That if you poison the water there, you'd be killing millions of people. So we recommended that at a minimum, the federal government needs to do better in terms of coordinating with the systemically important critical infrastructures and the entities that handle and control those functions, right? So the idea behind that is that you give them some benefits, right? There's benefits and burdens, carrots and sticks. You ask for, you give them intelligence, right? You give them better intelligence. You give them better access to the planning with the federal government in terms of incident response, in terms of, looking at their networks, dealing with all of the vulnerabilities they have. But you require a certain maturity level of cybersecurity, right? I like to think of security and cybersecurity by levels of maturity, not by sort of compliance checklists, not by, am I kind of like, meeting these XYZ requirements that are set up, for me from on high or from wherever, from some, I think the standards from NIST, for example, are very useful, very helpful guides, but I think that every company needs to take a look at them. Every policymaker should consider how they should be honed to each individual company and critical sector, because they're not meant to be sort of blanket answers to all questions. And so if we could give more support and provide a better sort of cooperative relationship, but also require sort of higher threshold for maturity for these critically important, the systemically important critical infrastructure. The acronym is SICI, but God, that's awful. Then we could have then we would do this better. We would at least be spending the limited resources of the federal government and the sort of limited bandwidth on those critical infrastructure that's most important, those entities that are most important, and we'd be protecting them better. I think that there's some agreement that that's a good way to go. We have a long way to getting this sort of passed and under law. This also sort of is it's passing it into law, something that exists not quite in quite that way currently. So the federal government has a list called the Section 9 list of the most critical infrastructure. But that list is secret that list. So there are entities that can say, like, I am on the Section 9 list, but it's not a public list, and shouldn't be. We wouldn't want to have a list which would be sort of like a target practice, right, for Russia or China. But that list is just that. It's a list, and it doesn't require anything of those entities, and it doesn't provide those entities anything particular from the federal government. So I think that we just need to do a little bit better, at least, and we need to start at that level, the systemically important critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's very interesting looking at the relationship, especially between the private sector and CISZA and other branches of the federal government that deal with cybersecurity. And there's an interesting question here that I think touches on an issue that, private companies have face different incentives when it comes from the federal government. And one thing is that in some cases, private companies and organizations may not want to reveal whether or not they've been breached, because it can be very bad press, it can damage their reputation. And in some cases they may not know, but in some cases they may know and not want to reveal the information. And they may not want to draw additional targets on their back. What do you think about the idea that there should be a proposal that makes breach notification to CISZA mandatory? How do you feel about that? And how, if not mandatory, then how else can we go about encouraging companies to sort of come forward and to better assess the state of cybersecurity in America?
So I fall firmly on the side that we need a national data breach notification law, because I've been at CISA. I've seen this attempt at doing this voluntarily. We've been trying to do this voluntarily for years. There's the sort of incident response center, right, within CISA, the NCIC. Now the CISA Central, or IOD as they call it. Well, the response center lives within IOD, within CISA. We've seen that be unsuccessful. So CISA took a look at it and said, what are we doing wrong? How can we improve it? There have been ongoing discussions on information sharing and how to improve everything at the White House level, at the NSC, National Security Council staff, as well as the federal agencies, again, for years, perhaps a decade. And I think that what we need to acknowledge is that what you said, it's a cultural issue. It's an issue of trust. It's an issue of people just not wanting to give up that information. Unfortunately, I think we've come to a point where that information is critical to our national security. And so we need to make sure that we're addressing these threats appropriately. And right now we are simply not. We're just not addressing those issues appropriately. And so for me, the National Data Breach Notification Law addresses that, one of those massive gaps, which is that we don't know when people get breached. The federal government doesn't have any idea, right? Or at least it doesn't have a full sort of a full view of it. They have certain bits and pieces. But I think that without mandatory reporting, you're never going to get that information. And therefore, you're never going to be able to address those problems. The CISA right now, for example, has automated information sharing, which is a program that allows companies to share information with CISA, and it shares threat information back with those companies, right? As an example, I will just tell you that the number of the sharing of information from CISA to companies, right, is extensive. Happens all the time on a daily basis. There's threat reporting, there's vulnerability disclosure, there's all this stuff, right? Not vulnerability disclosure, but discussions of vulnerabilities, TTPs, that's the sort of threats and protocols, how all of these things, how hackers are getting in, right, to help companies better secure their networks. The number of companies, okay, just think about the number of companies in America, okay, across the world, honestly. Just think about that number, think about literally what is that number? I have no idea. Millions of companies, right? Less than 10, let me say it again. Less than 10 share that data back with the government. So that is where voluntary, right, data reporting has gotten us. And now I'm not saying we couldn't make incremental progress and improve and work on the culture, but nothing seems to have helped, right? We even there was even a law passed in 2015 called SIZZA, actually, funny enough, but it was an information sharing law, right, which gave liability protection to companies that shared information with the government. And even that wasn't taken by corporations and their legal counsel as sufficient protection to share data breach notifications with the government. So if liability protection, sort of blanket liability protection for sharing information with the government, wasn't sufficient incentive, nothing's going to be sufficient incentive. So at this point, I think we're at the point where we now have to see this as a national security threat, and we need to address it with a national data breach notification law.
So earlier you talked about how SIZZA needs more resources, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of workers, people. And I think the shortage of, like, in general, the difficulty the government has in recruiting and maintaining a qualified cyber workforce is a fairly well-known problem. One idea that I've seen float around is the idea of like a federal civilian cyber corps. Can you talk a little bit about what this idea is and how it would be useful if implemented?
Sure. So broadly, yes, we have a big workforce shortage. It's something in the neighborhood of 450,000 openings right now, today, for cybersecurity positions that have been unfilled, right? To be fair, that's 100,000 less than last year. Now, I don't know if that means that 100,000 people stopped looking, or 100,000 jobs just got closed because companies couldn't find cybersecurity professionals. But this is an order of magnitudes problem bigger than the solutions that we're currently proposing, right? So we have, for example, scholarship for service, which allows something like 100 students a year or so, perhaps a little more, maybe in the neighborhood of 200 students a year, 300, to go to college, get their college paid for by being offered by serving 2 years in one of these agencies that does cybersecurity. So you go to college, they pay for your college, and then you give them 2 years of service when you come out. Okay, great program. We actually on the commission recommended that we extend that program, but increase it from 300 to something like 2,000 positions a year, right? 2,000 scholarships. That would address part of the need. But again, remember the number at the beginning, 450,000. So even 2,000 a year doesn't even get close to that. So the recommendation that you're talking about is a broader proposal. The proposal there is to develop a kind of cyber core within the federal government. If any of you guys know what the Foreign Service is, it's within the federal government, within the State Department, where it's a cohort of people. Every year, the State Department hires a certain amount of people to go into the Foreign Service. It's very prestigious. They hire the best and the brightest, and they pull them into service in the State Department, and they send them abroad, and they're representatives, they're ambassadors, they're visa passport officers, economic officers across the world in all of the different consulates in the United States consulates across the world, right? And so you have sort of diplomats, right? You're creating diplomats on a much larger scale than you are cyber. And so this sort of federal cyber corps would be similar to that. You would create sort of a cyber corps within the federal cohort, and then those people could go to different agencies, could be supporting cybersecurity across a number of agencies, like State Department, like Department of Defense, like EPA, like Department of Education, because every government, right, agency has networks. They all have computers, right? But like, do you trust the Bureau of like Land Management, right, to protect their networks against like a hack from Russia? I think not. So we need to have a fully trained, well-resourced cadre of people within the government who can address these issues and who perhaps rotate. I think we need to think about this sort of more broadly. NSA, for example, the National Security Agency, has a very impressive hiring authority and pull in the best and brightest people to serve at the NSA. They also have a much larger number of people who are serving at the NSA than those that work for CISA or for cybersecurity. So I think we need to think about resourcing the HR departments within CISA and DHS to hire on these people. We need to give more resources just for the staffing to get more salaries. We need to do this sort of cyber court, and we need to train these people so that they know what they're doing when they go out to the agencies.
Thanks. I know we're coming up on time, so I will end us up with one last listener question, which is you spoke a little bit about your time at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and they came out with a list of recommendations, of many of which made it into the NDAA. But what are some recommendations that have yet to be legislated that they gave for improving defensive cyber capabilities?
So there were a number of recommendations for defensive cybersecurity, including, for example, improving the National Guard and the ability of the cyber capabilities of the National Guard, because National Guard across the country, and so we need to improve those. That has a point back to about SICI, so a systemically important critical infrastructure. If we can do one more thing to defend our networks more, is to work with some of these most critical entities to ensure they are at least protected, so that we can have a stronger network and less glassy houses.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. And for all of our listeners who stayed on despite the technical difficulties, we apologize for that. And we appreciate your patience with us. Just a reminder that we will be doing this again next month to talk about defensive cybersecurity. So now that we've covered the offensive side, it's time to get our hands a little dirty and talk about offense. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much.